Perhaps the most misunderstood story in the air war is the B-29. This thing you see here is the so-called Superfortress, and, without exaggeration, it is literally the deadliest bomber in human history. Now, its story is followed by some really dark events, not just atomic bombs, those came at the end. There are things even worse than that aren't talked about as much, for some strange reason. We're going to tell you all of that today, starting with the bomber itself, then getting progressively more and more disturbing. Just a fair little warning before we proceed. Let's start from the beginning so everything makes sense. By 1942 and 1943, the war across the Pacific looked simple on a map, but not so much in reality. The Japanese home islands that the Allies now wanted to bomb sat far beyond the routine reach of American heavy bombers, and the Pacific was not Europe. Distances were vast, weather was unpredictable for most of the year, and bases were small coral dots that could not yet support the scale of operations that planners wanted. B-17s and B-24s had done impressive work, but their range, with a serious bomb load, left them short of the home islands. Their crews, even on shorter missions, could barely fight off fatigue and cold at high altitude without pressurization. The Army Air Forces began asking for something better already in 1940. A very long-range bomber that could fly higher, carry more, and try to keep its people alive on the way in and on the way out. They wanted something that could reach any city the enemy had, and they would get it, but no one could even imagine how dark it was going to get. Boeing's answer was the B-29 Superfortress, a leap forward rather than a step, but it was far from an easy journey. Now, the airplane carried its crew inside two pressurized compartments, one in the nose and one in the tail, with a small pressurized crawl tunnel over the twin bomb bays so people could move between them during flight. Pressurization simply means the airplane pumps air into a sealed space so the crew can breathe and stay warm at high altitude without wearing oxygen masks the whole time. For defense, the B-29 used remote power turrets, each tied to a computing gun sight. When a gunner tracked a target, the sight solved the math of speed, angle, and distance with an analog computer, then moved the guns to where the bullets needed to go. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing roughly 2,200 horsepower, pushed the bomber to altitudes above 28,000 feet, where thinner air gave some safety from fighters and flak. It carried thousands of gallons of fuel inside its wings and center section, and it had 2 very large bomb bays that would soon be loaded with general-purpose bombs, mines, or later, something far more disturbing. And no, it wasn't the atomic bombs. Maximum bomb loads could reach 20,000 pounds on short legs, but in practice, if you wanted to hit distant targets, you traded bombs for fuel, which meant many long-range missions were launched with modest loads. In simple words, if you need more fuel, you can carry fewer bombs, and more than one bomber crew would soon get these calculations wrong, as you're about to see. Crews learned quickly that fuel planning was everything, and that even a small change in headwinds could turn a safe margin into a dicey return. Some later missions would strip most gun turrets to save weight and extend range, which didn't feel comforting to the men up there. However, choices about protection will shape what comes next. The first shock that forced real change came when the second prototype had an engine fire during a test flight, lost control, and crashed, killing test pilot Eddie Allen, his crew, and people on the ground in the factory it hit. The investigation drove design and procedural changes, and it also hardened a checklist culture that would save lives later, at least some of them. The Superfortress was plagued with engine fires, oil leaks, and fuel leaks, so crews were learning on the go, developing procedures to save themselves when this happened. Training accidents, taxiway fires, and emergency landings stacked up as the first groups worked the airplane into something you could fight with. All of this was a dark beginning, and they hadn't even gone to combat yet. When the B-29 Superfortress first went into combat against the Japanese home islands, the idea seemed simple enough. The new bomber would fly higher and farther than anything before it, cruising above most defenses, and would strike with precision on industrial targets that fed the Japanese war machine. At least, that was the theory. In practice, things unraveled almost immediately. The first operations in 1944, flown out of India and staged through forward bases in China, showed that reaching Japan was possible, but only at enormous effort. Every gallon of fuel and every bomb had to be ferried across the Himalayas in transport planes, or even in stripped-down B-29s carrying fuel instead of bombs. Crews called this supply run the Hump, and it quickly became clear that the operation was eating itself alive. The bombers burned much of the fuel they carried just to get across the mountains, so by the time they arrived in China, the stockpiles were barely enough to mount a raid. Still, the Americans pressed ahead, and on June 15, 1944, B-29s carried out the first strike against the Japanese home islands since the Doolittle Raid of 1942. Their target was the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata. It proved the point. Japan itself was now within reach, yet the damage was modest, nothing compared to the effort required to get those bombers into the air. Japanese raids on the forward bases in China made matters worse, burning supplies and cratering airfields. The whole campaign seemed unsustainable, and commanders wondered why such a powerful aircraft was producing such disappointing results. The answer came in November 1944, when a reconnaissance B-29 flew a photo mission over Tokyo. The aircraft carried cameras instead of bombs and returned with thousands of images, but it also revealed something far more important. At bombing altitude, the crew had encountered winds stronger than anything they had ever seen, often well over 200 miles an hour. Without realizing it, they had stumbled into the jet stream. For a high-altitude bomber, this was devastating because bomb runs became impossible to time correctly. Bombs were blown far off their aiming points, and fuel calculations were thrown completely out of balance. Crews would return home after a mission only to discover that they no longer had the fuel reserves they had planned on. Some never made it back at all, forced to ditch into the sea when the headwinds had simply drained their tanks dry. Engine trouble added another layer of danger. The Wright R-3350 engines were advanced for their time but temperamental, with a tendency to overheat, and the engines sometimes caught fire without much warning. On the long, heavy takeoffs from tropical bases, those fires could be catastrophic. Crews feared their own engines more than Japanese fighters, because once a B-29 caught fire, there was little they could do to save it when they were so far from their base. The tide began to turn with the capture of the Marianas in mid-1944. Now, as you can see here on the map, the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were firmly in American hands, and airfields were built there on a scale the world had never seen. Northfield on Tinian alone had 4 massive runways and became the largest bomber base of the war. From the Marianas, every major Japanese city was finally within range. The desperate supply chain over the Himalayas was no longer needed, and the Superfortress could now attack as often as weather and maintenance allowed. But the wind problem did not go away, and neither did the poor results from high-altitude precision bombing. By January 1945, command of the campaign passed to General Curtis LeMay, and he quickly abandoned the original doctrine. Instead of tight formations at 30,000 feet, he ordered low-altitude night attacks flown by individual bombers. Defensive guns were stripped out to save weight, leaving only the tail gun. The extra capacity was filled with fuel and incendiary bombs. If the winds scattered high-altitude bombing, then the solution was simple: get under the winds, carry more bombs, and set entire cities on fire. You heard that right. The most notorious was the M69, a small cylinder filled with napalm gel. Dozens of them were packed into a cluster and released together, scattering in mid-air and smashing through the flimsy roofs of Japanese houses before bursting into flames. Other larger incendiaries added heat and kept the fires alive once they had started. Japanese homes, built literally of wood and paper, crammed together in dense neighborhoods, turned bombings into destruction never seen before or since in our history. The full demonstration came in the night, between March 9th and 10th, 1945. Over 300 B-29s flew over Tokyo at altitudes of only 5,000 to 9,000 feet, each loaded with nothing but incendiaries. They laid their bombs in a great X across the Shitamachi district, and then the stream of aircraft fanned out to cover the rest of the city. What followed was the single deadliest air raid in history. In just a few hours, an area of about 16 square miles was reduced to ashes. Over 90,000 people were killed, 1 million were left homeless, and more than 250,000 buildings were destroyed. We can't even begin to describe the scene on the ground without this video being terminated from YouTube, but we can say this: people were leaping into water-filled canals and reservoirs to save themselves from the flames, but the water itself would begin boiling from the immense heat. You can put the rest to your imagination. However, Tokyo was only the beginning. In the months that followed, city after city was subjected to the same treatment. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens more were burned in turn. By August, 66 Japanese cities had been hit, and about 40% of the urban area of Japan had been destroyed. Millions were left homeless, and the civilian toll was beyond comprehension. The justification at the time was that Japan's war production was dispersed into countless small workshops tucked inside these cities. Destroy the cities, and you destroyed the ability to make weapons. That sounded fair until you thought about the ordinary people living there with their families and children who had nothing to do with the ongoing war. On the night of March 9th alone, more civilians died in Tokyo than in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And yet, this was still not the final act of the B-29 campaign. And before the atomic bombs, as the pinnacle of World War II's madness, we have another dark point to cover. It is the story of what happened to the crews who never made it back. The men who parachuted into Japan or the sea and found themselves prisoners in 1945. Their fate was a different kind of darkness. A B-29 could be brought down by flak, by fighters, or by its own failing engines. And when that happened, the crew had only two choices. They could ditch in the ocean or bail out over enemy territory. Neither option promised survival, but they had to try. If you went into the sea, training and equipment gave you a chance. Each man carried a one-man raft, a mirror, a die marker, and a small emergency radio. Submarines prowled near target areas, waiting to pick up survivors, and flying boats could swoop in when the weather allowed. Well, sometimes it worked and a crew was home by the next morning. But other times, storms blew in, the sea was too rough, or the men drifted too close to Japan. In those cases, rescue never came. And if you landed in Japan itself, well, basically you were screwed on so many levels that perhaps the better option was to die in the crash. Captured airmen were not treated as regular prisoners of war. Japanese law branded them as war criminals because of the bombing campaign, so interrogations and punishments were such that we can't describe them on YouTube. Some were locked inside city prisons, and guess what happened to them during firebombings? Can you imagine that? Being killed by the bombs of your fellow bomber crews. Others were taken to places where some truly disturbing things happened, ranging all the way to cannibalism. In Kyushu, downed B-29 crewmen became subjects of medical experiments. We won't describe those here, and honestly, we wouldn't recommend you go looking for that on the internet, but the cruelty reached a level that words can barely describe. After the war, there were trials, and some of the people responsible were convicted, but most never faced justice, just as no one faced any justice for firebombings and nukes. Now, you already know the story of the atomic bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are names everyone has heard, but here's something most people don't realize. Among the dead were Allied prisoners who had survived being shot down, only to be killed when the bombs detonated above their heads. The bombers themselves were B-29s, specially modified for the mission. Their gun turrets were stripped out to save weight, the bomb bays rebuilt, and the airframes reworked so they could carry a single massive device. One flew to Hiroshima on August 6th. Another diverted from Kokura to Nagasaki 3 days later. The casualties were staggering. Tens of thousands died instantly, and many more in the weeks that followed as radiation sickness spread, making instant death in the explosion seem like an easier way out. And here's the darker detail. Those 2 bombs were not the end of the plan. A third was already prepared, with more to follow if Japan had not surrendered, which, luckily for the whole planet, did not happen. Even after the war, the B-29's story with nuclear weapons was not over. In 1946, during Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll, one of them dropped another atomic device. The second blast, set off underwater, coated entire warships in radioactive fallout. Crews tried to scrub it off, but the contamination clung to steel and paint. In the end, many of those ships had to be scuttled, because no one dared use them again. And that's only the information publicly released. We can only wonder what else happened that is still kept secret. For the B-29, however, the end of World War II didn't mean the end of its service, because then came Korea. At first, the Superfortress seemed to fit its old role, bombing bridges, rail yards, and factories. But the skies had changed, and Soviet-built MiG-15 jets were something new, faster and heavily armed, far beyond what a piston bomber could handle. Daylight missions turned into massacres, and after one especially costly raid in October 1951, the order was given that there would be no more daylight attacks. From then on, the B-29s flew rarely. And if they did, they flew at night, low and in the dark, while jets carried the war in daylight. The age of the Superfortress was over. And just like that, the bomber that once carried America's heaviest blows faded into history, leaving behind a legacy filled with examples of just how sick our species can be in its darkest moments.